Alright guys, so in this video I'm going to go for a quick demonstration on how to use the access modifiers and the knowledge that you need as part of the Java exam. So, dependent on how and the scenario in which you use the access modifiers determines their behaviors. So whether or not you're using them with classes or with methods or with variables, they're very similar, but there are subtle differences. So what I've done here is gone through I think all the possible examples on how to use the access modifiers and how they interact with different classes within different packages and have associated methods within those classes interact with other classes regardless on its location or not. So two scenarios when it comes to access modifiers. You can either use them with classes or you can use them with methods and variables. Quickly jump through. When we use access modifiers with classes, we're only concerned about two things. One is allowing the class to be seen by other classes, or we're trying to enforce the fact that other classes cannot see this particular class. So what we do here is apply either a public or we leave it blank, being the default. And just to note there's only two access modifiers you can associate onto the class level. So as I mentioned, within the public, it can be accessible by any other class, regardless on its package, or it can be left as default, which means that it can only be accessible by a class within the same package. So a couple of examples here. I have the public class that, because it is public on the left hand side, it can be seen by any other class within any other package, given the assumption that you've imported it into that class. The other example that you have is leaving the class by default, meaning that it can only be available from within the same package. So you can see here the jet engine is left as default, which subsequently means that only the spaceship class within the same package can access that particular class. So that's the classes in a nutshell. Methods and variables, you have four different access modifiers. So public, there's no restriction basically. So if the class can be seen by another class and the method or the variable is public, it's able to see that particular method or variable. A default, very similar, exactly the same scenario as before, is that if you have a method or a variable that is public, it is accessible, but it's only accessible by a class in the same package. So I'll quickly go through two examples, actually all four examples in a bit. Moving on to the protected, very similar to the default, but there is a circumstance where it can also be accessible for inheritance, which I'll go through in a little bit as well, into more detail. When it's private, the class that it's associated to that particular method or variable can only access that method or variable. So if it's set as private within the class, no other class is going to be able to access that method or variable. So within public method or variable, you can see here on the left hand side I have the first arrow pointing to a string value that is public, and then the second one is pointing to a method which is also public. Given the assumption that if you import this, which I'll go through in more detail in a bit, what I'm doing here is importing this package into the spaceship class. So given the assumption that the spaceship class can see this particular class through the class level, and the public is assigned, then that particular class that resides in a different package can see those variables or those methods. One thing to note here is that I have, and I'll again go through the demonstration in a bit, I have the accountant class that cannot see this particular class. If that is the circumstance, if this class cannot see the other class, it can't access these methods regardless on its access modifier. So that's one circumstance to be considerate of, is can it see it by its access modifier on the class? Secondly, is it actually importable? And thirdly, have a look at the access modifier onto the method and variable themselves. So on the top left-hand side here, you can see the spaceman class. It was public now, but it's actually now set to default, meaning that it doesn't have the public associated to that class. And when you have that circumstance, it puts a restriction on other classes seeing this particular class. So if it does not reside in the same package, then subsequently some of the other classes cannot access this. So I have an example here. I'm trying to make on the bottom left here, I'm trying to make an instance of this space class because it's not accessible, because it resides in a different package, and I get compiling errors saying that it cannot find this particular class to create this instance. So if the class is not accessible, the methods and variables will become unavailable regardless on its on how open the access modifier is on that variable or method. So you can see here on the right hand side I have two arrows pointing to variables, and one variable and one method. So you can see at the start there's no public, protected or private associated, subsequently meaning that it's left as default. And when it's left at default, only these values are only available from classes within the same package. So here, the jet engine class resides in the same package as the spaceship class, and with that in mind, it can then access these variables and methods. When it comes to protected methods and variables, it's very much the same as default, but it can also be accessed through inheritance. So what I mean by that, the association between the classes can be determined by two scenarios. One is the inheritance or the composition. So when it's inheritance, you're stating the relationship of the class is a particular class. So I have here two scenarios in which an accountant is a person, and then an astronaut also is a person. And when you consider two classes to have that relationship of is a, the best practice would be to extend that particular class. So when you extend that, you can inherit the variables from the superclass to be used by the subclasses associated to it. So we can have a commonality between the methods and variables within the person class that can then also be used by the spaceman class, and then also the accountant class. In contrast, you have the composition. So in this scenario, you're stating that a class is built up by a construction of another class. So within a spaceship has an engine, and then in this weird scenario, you have a spaceship has an astronaut associated to it. You would never say an astronaut is a spaceship or a spaceship is an astronaut. But when you have this scenario, you're creating an instance of the class. And this is where we're going if I go back. When we have it as default, when we have it as protected, it's like default, but when it's accessed for inheritance, that will also allow that availability. Private methods and variables. So when we have an associated access modifier being private to a particular variable and method, it can only then be accessible by the class in which it's associated to. So because the spaceship class has the private method, only the spaceship class can use that. No other classes, regardless on whether or not it's the same in the same package or it creates an instance, can use that. It's just that one class. The other scenario that you have is local variables. So if you have a variable declared within a method, which I have here, I create a new string called success. When I have that, it's classed as a local variable. And when you have a local variable, it can only be accessible during the lifespan of this method. So when I go through all the lines and then come to the end of this method, this particular variable will not be accessible anymore. It's only accessible within the method in which you're using it in. And because of that, you don't need to have any access modifier associated to it. It's just that method using it. And if you do have any access modifier associated to a local variable, it will throw a compiling error. So one thing just to note is that you just have to leave, you have to make sure that no access modifier is associated to that particular local variable. You know what, that'll do. So the class in which has the main method doesn't actually have to have the public access modifier associated to it. That's one thing to take into account. I have, well, before I continue, you can see within the spaceship class, I'm creating instances, in fact 2 instances, of 2 separate jet engines. I don't know if jet engines are associated to spaceships. I'm not sure if that's correct terminology. But I have 2 instances of the engines, and then I'm creating a new instance of an astronaut. So with this in mind, you know, I'm stating that a spaceship has 2 engines and it has an astronaut. If it was inheritance, I would not create new instances. I would simply extend them, which I'll show you in a little bit more detail in a bit. If I go into, let's say, Spaceman, for instance, actually before I continue, so you can see jet engine here, because spaceship creates a new 2 new instances, it needs to be accessible. That particular class needs to be accessible by this class. So jet engine needs to be accessible by spaceship, and because it resides in the same package, it doesn't need the public access modifier associated to it. If the spaceship can see the jet engine, it would be, I mean, you can put the public value into here, it will still compile. It's probably best practice to make sure it cannot be accessible by any other any other classes within your program. And it's just the best way to enforce encapsulation within Java and within its associated classes. Spaceman is slightly different. So similar to jet engine, I'm creating a new instance of the Spaceman, but it resides in a separate package. And when that's the case, I need to import either the package or specifically that class. So here you can see I'm bringing in that class within the import. What I can also do is state any classes within the astronaut package, also bring it in. So dependent, it doesn't. There's no dependency on which way you do this. It's normally best practice to have a single class, but again, I think it's more based on preference. So what you need to do is make sure that the class, spaceman class, if you're importing that particular class into a new class from a separate package, you have to make sure it's public. So if this spaceman was not accessible, it was not public, you'll see compiling errors to saying that it basically cannot find that particular class. So I'll just change the visibility, and now I can see it.